Hi everybody, and welcome to this Trustee Learning Programme session from Getting On Board. I'm Penny from Getting On Board, and today we're talking about making an impact as a trustee, which has really piqued your interest. We've got lots of people signed up this afternoon. So before I pass over to Ange Handa, who's chairing today, and to our panel, a few bits of housekeeping. So you will have seen that the session is being recorded. You'll get access to the recording via a Zoom link. That recording will include the chat, so please be aware of that. If you're posting anything to the chat, you might not want to post anything sensitive. The recording will also go onto YouTube. Please also be aware of that. If you come off mute, if you've got your video on, that will go onto YouTube. So please don't do that if you'd rather not be on YouTube. Please stay muted on the call. You've been muted as you've come into the room. Stay muted unless Ange comes to you for a question. We have enabled closed captions at our end, so if you'd like the subtitles, you need to enable them at your end by clicking closed caption or CC on your device. Session content is specific to England and Wales, although with a session like this, to be honest, it's pretty much applicable anywhere in the world, and you're very, very welcome. But obviously, if there are legal references, you'll want to make sure that they're applicable to wherever you are operating. Please absolutely use the chat, use it to share where you're from, to introduce yourselves, to ask questions, to share comments. And then finally, a huge thank you to Starfish, TPP, Peridot, Diversifying Group and Charisma, who sponsored this session. And it's thanks to them that this session is free. And we've also got Rebecca Davey from Diversifying Group on our panel today as well. So a double thank you to them. So thank you very much. And I'm going to pass over to Ange.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining what I hope will be a fantastic session today. I'm Ange Handa, I'm the course director for Getting On Board's Charity Board Leadership Programme. I'm an experienced charity trustee. I've been a charity chair and a university governor, having been on boards for about 20 years. So I've really seen the good, the bad and the ugly of impact and behaviours on charity boards. I'm also a professional speaker. And when we talk about impact, we often think about being big, having a great personality, really showing up loud and proud. But that's not really what impact means on a charity board. Rather, it's more about our influence, the way we have an influence over others in a positive manner, how we choose to make a difference, our behaviours, our actions, our emotional intelligence, our approach, our consistency, how prepared we are, our knowledge, our authority, our experience, and our lived experience expertise as well. So I'm delighted today that we've got such a great panel. Fiona, Mark and Rebecca, who I'm shortly going to invite to introduce themselves. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. As we go along today, I will monitor the chat and I will invite some questions. We may not get to all of them, for that I apologise in advance, but I will be picking those out, and it's great to see so many people signed up. So I'm going to go on to our first panellist, who I can see on screen, and Fiona, that's you. Would you please introduce yourself? So what interested you in this subject today? What brought you here? And please tell us a bit about your involvement with charity trustees.
Well, first of all, hello, and yeah, it's fantastic to see so many people here today. I am Getting On Board's communications director, and broadly I work in communications and writing, are my two focuses. And my role as a trustee, I've been a trustee for 3 years for a literacy charity. And I also chair a local community group as well. So I'll be speaking to both because they're quite interesting in the way that they contrast and how they complement each other. And obviously I've met hundreds and hundreds of absolutely fantastic trustees through Getting On Board. And I also do some work with some other charities as well. So I'm lucky in that I've got quite a rounded view of trusteeship, and I'm lucky that I'm able to see lots of different boards and how they work and draw sort of some conclusions from that. And later on I'll talk more about what drew me into trusteeship, but I'll hand back to Ange for the time being.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Fiona, and I'm looking forward to hearing your insights about the community perspectives as well. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Ange, and really great to see so many faces, and really excited to join you all today. I'm Mark Dunwell. I've been working with boards now for about 10 years in lots of different capacities. So working with executive teams, working with the higher education bodies, so the student union sector, something I'm very passionate about, and more recently thinking about social mobility and social justice, so a leading knife crime charity. So for me, I thought this was a really important topic, given that I have joined a board based on the mentoring and coaching of others, and I felt that the ability to kind of make an impact is something that isn't necessarily linked to having to have a lived experience of a particular topic. Being passionate, having credible skills, and taking an interest in making differences absolutely valuable and something that charities really need. So that's a bit about me. And in my day job, I am a public sector and healthcare lead for an experience consultancy called Clarisis, so looking after our UK and US public sector work.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Mark. And of course, social mobility and social justice, a couple of topics that we all have to consider, whichever charity board that we're on. So looking forward to exploring how you make an impact in that sector, and particularly with the themes that you work on shortly. Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. There are so many of you here. It's so nice to see you all. I'm Rebecca. I am the head of the board practice, actually, at Diversifying Group, one of the sponsors. I have been a recruiter for a really long time, 12, 13 years now, doing board stuff specifically for about 3.5, 4 years. We're not sector specific at Diversifying Group, so I get client side a lot of different perspectives, I guess, from different sectors. And in terms of individuals, obviously that makes it even a much more a bigger plethora of individuals that I'm talking to and building relationships with. I'm also a first-time trustee for a very small local charity to me, and I'm sit on the board of a local school here as well. So I think from my input here is going to be two different perspectives, mostly from a recruiter, talking to you about how the individuals that I've placed or I've spoken to have made impacts and the stories that I've heard, but also kind of learning as well to see how I can best make an impact in my role. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rebecca. And I'm sure for some of the people on this call, they don't even know that charity trustee recruitment is a thing. That's certainly been our experience at getting on board. So again, it'll be great to hear how one makes an impact by being put forward by you in the first place. So that's certainly an angle that we'll want to look at today as well. So Fiona, I'm going to come back to you. I have a question. I have a couple of formal questions for our panel just to get us started. To our audience here, please do pop your questions in the chat. As I said, I'm going to try to answer or get our panel to answer as many as we can. But I'd love to hear from each of you. First of all, what have been your ways of making an impact on boards, both during meetings and outside of them? So Fiona, I'll start with you first.
Thanks, Ange. I think when the impact that I make in and out of meetings, I think the two things that I carry into a meeting, and I mean this really mindfully, like I really try and hold these things when I go into a board meeting, is the impact that I need to make from the point of view of what the charity needs, and then how the board works, like thinking about how we interrelate as a board. And I really try and hold both of those equally, because they both need to work alongside each other if you're going to have impact more broadly as a trustee. And I was thinking about this when I was kind of preparing for the panel. I was thinking that obviously there are in all the areas of my life, I sort of pay attention to all of them and just like, sort of do what I need to do. But I think there's something about being a trustee and being on a board, the weight of responsibility. I really consider that when I go into a board meeting, because I think, there's only so many people in that room. Like the board usually roughly between about anywhere between sort of 5 and top end maybe 11, 12. It's not very many people to be holding the responsibility of that organisation. So I really try and be mindful about that. And without wanting to overthink it, just think, just hold that when we're thinking about decision making, when we're thinking about the strategy, and also kind of moving to your second part of your question, to outside the meeting, just being really respectful of everybody's time, and making sure that those interactions that we do have outside of those meetings are really pointed towards the impact that we want to create. And that goes to how we work with amongst ourselves as trustees, how we work with our CEO, and also very much sort of building that community. So I would say that those are the sort of main areas. And just one final point. So I think when I think coming from Getting on Board and working for Getting on Board, and we have like a huge focus on governance, we have a huge focus on inclusion. So that's something that I'm always really mindful of, and just thinking about who is speaking in those meetings. Did anyone else need to speak? Just sort of thinking about ways to bring different people in, particularly in the community group that I'm part of, which we're thinking about, we're considering becoming a charity later in the year. So it's sort of moving into that structure. There's quite often a really diverse group, and just thinking about different ways actually to make sure that people are able to speak into that space and be heard is really important. I'll stop there. There's more that I could say, but perhaps I'll sort of give other people a bit of their time.
Thank you. And there's so much we can take for that, which I'm sure we will. I heard a few key things, and things that I also echo: humility. We have to leave our egos at the door, and positive board relations. So great points, Fiona. And I like your points about including voices as well. I think when we make things accessible for one person, we make things accessible for all. So panel, I'd love to hear your views on the things that Fiona has said and that you will each say. Mark.
Thanks, Ange. I had a similar point around what's important to bring, and for me it's about understanding where that organisation is today, and I think that's with the mindset of really understanding where they are in their journey. So if I think of one of the charities I was working with, we had just been through kind of 10 years of existing, very much founder-led organisation, and where we were is we needed to make that really big step away from the founder, having all the key relationships, having all of the knowledge about our beneficiaries, about our people, about our suppliers, and needing to think about how do we formalize some of that across a broader group of people. So for me, understanding where they were was kind of step one. And then for me to make an impact, it was then about thinking credibly about what skills I had that I could try and devote to helping move that forward in a practical way alongside the senior management team. So some of that is about passion and energy and being pragmatic around if you've got volunteer organizations, talking about the problem is partly good to identify that there is a problem, but sometimes getting stuck in and being willing to attend events, take notes, facilitate sessions to get insights from your users are really, really helpful. But equally, some of the kind of more strategic lens around financial management, helping really keep a focus on, are we delivering on those charitable objects and not necessarily the operational priorities of today, and trying to keep that really fine balance. So understanding where the board is today, and also thinking about what energy you can bring uniquely that align to your skills, I think are really good ways inside and outside of meetings to make an impact.
Really useful points, Mark, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of very small charities on this call today who have no or very few staff or are founder-led, and again, that's a common challenge that charity boards face, where maybe the founder chief exec holds a lot of the knowledge and systems haven't necessarily been put in place. What happens if someone's sick? What happens if someone goes that intern? How can you as a trustee make an impact? So I'm loving that pragmatism and just admitting where there's a problem. That communication, and I think Fiona alluded to it as well, is critical, isn't it? And I think when assets and resources are scarce, those lines can also blur. So for us, how do we find the balance? Rebecca, I can see you nodding, and I know you're a trustee at a small charity, so let's hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. I am just nodding away furiously to everything that Fiona and Mark have been saying, because I again, prepping for this, they basically said everything that I was going to say, but in different ways. I think for me, definitely when it's a smaller charity, those lines get really blurred, and it's really important to try and remember what you're there to do. Hopefully there are some people working full time and to continue to do things sort of on a more practical operational basis, but you are there to really help at that sort of strategic level. And I think even from a recruiter's perspective, when we're talking to clients, it's very much looking for individuals who have that passion, have that energy, want to understand the organization, where they're at, and getting up to speed on things quite quickly. You can make quite an impact quite quickly if you know what's going on. If you don't know what's going on, it's going to take a little while to be able to make an impact. But also kind of just remembering while you're there in terms of your skill set, you might have been appointed for a particular reason, whether it's HR, whether it's legal, whether it's communications. You know, how can your skill set, your daily work, be transferable into helping and making an impact for that charity once you understand what the needs are.
Brilliant points, Rebecca, and it's hard to make the kind of difference that we want if we come in blindsided, isn't it? So yeah, that open transparency is crucial. Fiona, I'm just going to come back to you, because you spoke to the point about making an impact outside of meetings, and what you were alluding to was about boundaries and being respectful of other people's time. I also talked about board relations, so I'd like to hear from each of you about building that trust and connection with each other, because of course as trustees we have to make our decisions jointly. It doesn't all just sit with us as individuals. So how have you worked to form those bonds, to build your relationships with fellow trustees, but also being respectful of their time? Fiona, I'll come back to you first, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, because one of the things that I didn't take full account of, I think, before I came a trustee, is that you don't meet your fellow trustees that often. And so it's that much harder to really start building a rapport and a relationship with people when you don't. So I think some of the ways that I've tried to address that is one of the initiatives that I introduced was that it was quite an obvious one. We set up a WhatsApp group, and we have, you know, we use that to share just like news articles or just general news. Like some people share, you know, if people have sort of had a particular life event, might share news with it and that. And our CEO is part of the group and will share updates from pieces of work and volunteers, like if they work with young people. So if there are really lovely comments that those young people are happy to share, she might put those in. So all of that really helps build a relationship. And other initiatives, thinking about you know, other ways that we can use our time together. So it's a bit of a contentious one, whether you should have your meetings on Zoom or whether you should have them in person, and how you balance that with people's accessibility needs, but constantly looking at and revisiting that and making that part of the conversation. And one of the things I wanted to say as well, like talking to both points that Mark and Rebecca were making about the balance and boundaries and trying to hold all of that, is when I think about the board culture, I really try and make myself look at it through the prism of what the charity needs, not just, I suppose, what I would like or what I think will work best, because sometimes you don't need to take it to the nth degree. It just needs to work for the charity because that's what you're there for. So sort of trying to hold all of that. And the other thing, which I think is on a personal level, it took me quite a long time, I think, to not come out of myself, but to bring a certain part of myself to that. And I think that that's partly who I am as a person and how I might move a little bit, you know, some people might get to that point quicker, but also it was partly, I think, about just respecting the group. Because you don't have a lot of time to meet, you have to think about how you position things and how you might bring your point of view. It's different to how you might work with people that you meet every day, or you work in a different workplace. So it's just bearing all of that in mind, really, and hoping that those objectives that you're looking at you know, whether it's a particular work stream or a particular point on the strategy, that you're holding that in mind with everything, with all those other points. It's a lot. I think it's a lot to hold actually when you're a trustee, but you know, it is part of that balancing act that that Mark and Rebecca were talking about.
It is, but it's testimony to your thoughtful nature, Fiona, I think I'm picking up here. But for sure, you know, how we are holding the issue, people's difference in style and approach, so all of those different attributes and characteristics that I mentioned earlier. And we see each other so infrequently, it's hard to form a benchmark of people's behaviour in a way that we would do at work or in our social circles. Mark, what do you think?
Furiously nodding, but definitely would agree with much of what Rebecca and what Fiona was describing there. I think for me, tone is everything. That there's a often well talked about stat around kind of 55% of everything we do is body language, 7% is in the words, but it's that middle bit around the kind of tone which is actually really critical. And when you don't have that context behind actually the operational priorities that someone might be working on, or the energy they've brought into their day just due to what's going on in their own lives, let alone some of the many challenging both charitable compliance or financial kind of obligations that you need to meet. So just being really conscious of that tone, I think is really important. But to enable that, I think one of the things I try to do is think about how can you help role model and create that psychologically safe environment for a discussion that might not always be the easiest to have. And typically with decisions, when they're really easy to make, then there are lots of really capable people who quickly make those. So typically when it comes to board meetings as trustees, you're having to make decisions on the margins, in the grey, on topics that are going to have quite significant cross-cutting issues to beneficiaries and to the organisation. So very similar to Fiona's point earlier around thinking about understanding what the needs are for your organisation. I think a good example of that for the kind of knife crime charity that I work with is that we always try and make sure that we keep big issues that are important to us front and center. So it's thinking about how the changes we make at a board level have implications to the people engaging with our services day to day, and really trying to keep that rooted in a reality. So yeah, just a couple of thoughts on how as a trustee you can try and help connect those strategic conversations, inviting contributions for lots of people in that psychologically safe way along the way too.
I'm really glad you talked about psychological safety, Mark, because I would have introduced it otherwise. Let's talk psychological and cultural safety, because we have Rebecca here who works with candidates looking for those roles. So Rebecca, I'm sure this is an area of focus for you. And for those candidates, and you know, me myself, when you are the only in a workplace or on a board, it's well documented the levels of burnout and stress that one can experience in terms of making your mark, getting your voice heard is additional. And when you're a double only, when you hold two or more characteristics, for example, it becomes harder still. And that's where we see people leave boards quite quickly. So Rebecca, any advice that you've got? What do you advise your candidates?
It's a really interesting one. I'll just say, Fiona, the WhatsApp thing is quite interesting. I think we have levels of how much people were going to put in there and how much it's got a strong governance. I'm not sure, but really interesting point. But I think that the psychological safety thing is a huge challenge for us. Obviously, a diversifying group, we are an inclusion and diversity consultancy. So when we're talking to individuals about being first-time trustees, that is definitely a conversation that we have a lot. If they are the first, it's something, it's half and half, isn't it? They can come in and have to have the right attitudes and the right ways to go about building relationships with individuals, but also, you know, the current chair very much falls to them to create an environment where people feel like they can belong and have a voice and have it heard. And that's for everybody, not just for someone with a protected characteristic, but it very much is a two-pronged thought process. And I think for the candidates, you know, trying to reach out and to Fiona's point, I think the contentious point of being in person sometimes, if you can, it's not always possible, but having, you know, a coffee with someone outside of board meetings, meeting with the chair, joining a committee potentially, because even then you've got a little bit more time with some individuals and you can really start to build those relationships, and you can see that that can be really beneficial when you're trying to make an impact.
Great responses, thank you. And we've had a brilliant question in the chat from Jane Redman. Any tips or practical ideas about how to create a psychologically safe environment when you have some people physically in a room and some trustees joining in virtually? I gave a generic answer about psychological safety. All trustees should call out strong chair. For hybrid meetings, strong chairing for sure. But all trustees can play a part. Who's had experience of hybrid meetings? Probably all of us, from COVID years at least. Fiona, on to you first. What's worked well, what hasn't, what's worked less well?
Perhaps controversially, I would say I'm just so not a fan of them. I know they can't be avoided sometimes, but I think they are really, really difficult spaces to get right. So I would say if there's any way that you can avoid it, my personal advice would be try and find a way around it. If you can't, some of the things I think make a really big difference are the level of tech you have. I think if you are able to in any way invest in tech that supports a hybrid meeting, that will make a huge difference. Again, small charities totally appreciate that that's might not be possible. I think you just have to do a lot of checking in. I think you have to check in beforehand with people to see, to make sure everyone's really aware. If there's a way that you can get people to say whether they're going to be coming, just so you've got a sense of how many people are going to be online, how many people are going to be in the room, who it's going to be, if those people need any particular type of support or tech, just make sure you've got all of that kind of cleared off. Other things, yeah, as a check-in after the meeting as well, whether that's with an anonymous survey you can send around and, you know, get people to share their comments, or just spend a bit of time afterwards making sure that everybody understood what they needed to, and so on. As someone's just put, Olivia's just put in the comments that at my last charity, they alternated in person and online meetings, which worked well. I think that if you can do that instead, I would definitely take that over over hybrid. But I appreciate for different charities, different circumstances, it's not always possible.
Yeah, I'm minded to agree, Fiona. I think it's either everyone online or everyone in person if possible, but bearing accessibility and other needs into account. But it was, Mark, as you were saying, in terms of body language, it's a lot about what is unsaid, and here we are on Zoom even today without only above the shoulders visible, so we're not really giving much away in terms of what's going on within our bodies, what we're thinking, maybe what we're feeling. So what are your thoughts on this, psychologically safe spaces in online meetings?
Yeah, I think it's a really tricky one. I think having, as like you said, Ange and Fiona, around the kind of parity, so having everyone engaging in the same mechanism of communication, whether we're all online or not, I think is a really helpful start. I think there's also a lot of really helpful things you can put in place before the meeting to create a great conversation. So thinking about how people like to digest content, so really thinking consciously about if you are going to have the potential to discuss something that's going to be really expansive topic, just thinking about, is there a way to break that down into many different opportunities for people to engage with an ideas conversation type session versus we're making a decision about this today, and you need to be ready and carry that kind of trustee hat of giving a view on something. So just thinking about where you are in decision making as a board can be really helpful. there's been some tactical things that I've seen work really well at previous charities. So pairing trustees up, so you've got more experience in people maybe who are slightly newer to the organization, to build some of that understanding about the richness of the skills you have within the organization, but also that helps people to try and get a better understanding of who each other are, and to be able to try and smooth the way to have those often positive conversations and sometimes more difficult conversations about topics that are a bit more contentious. But a really novel tactic where I was working with a really small charity, very much volunteer led. There were 5 or 6 of us helping drive it. Just changing the location of where we caught up meant that it acted as a way to restructure the environment. We engaged in it a bit differently. It kind of changed the chairs, so people didn't have a natural chair who they always looked to. So that was a kind of clever way of us not going into a formal meeting board mode for potentially some of those slightly more expansive conversations around what the future strategy of the organisation might be. How can we better deliver on some of the services that we had for our beneficiaries?
Absolutely. I think there's nothing like some light and air and a change of scene for those productive strategy setting sessions or board away days. Thanks, Mark. And we've had a brilliant comment here that supports some of what you've said as well by Owen Hewson. The board of a charity I worked for previously had a standing final agenda item inviting trustees to share reflections on the meeting process, brackets, not a chance to revisit meetings, meetings or business. So encouraging reflections on how well the meeting worked for each trustee, whether they felt they were able to input any technical or process reflections that might help improve things, and anything really from a process and meeting format side which would improve the quality of the meeting. I love that, because that regular check-in and review of boards can really help us make individual and collective impact as well. Rebecca, what about your thoughts?
Yeah, I've actually heard a few charities do that sort of share reflection thing, and I think it's always had a really positive outcome. I don't know if they've always done it sort of as a standing agenda at the end of a meeting, but it's definitely been something that has been welcomed. So I think that's really helpful. I think checking in as the meetings go, especially if someone's online, you know, Rebecca, have you got anything to add, etc., etc. Just making sure that the person knows that, you know, well, hopefully they're still there. they haven't run off to the children or whatever, and just making sure that everyone just feels like they have a space to be heard, because that just goes so far to have people think, oh, I'm recognizing here that someone might not have spoken for a little bit, let me check in and see if they're all right, whether they're in the meeting or not. I think it's really important.
In different ways, everyone has said, you know, something about being heard, and we all want to be heard, don't we, in some way. Can you think of anyone on a board or that you've come across in your board work that has made an impact in you, that has helped you to feel heard, maybe, or some other way that they've had an impact on you? Any great role models out there? Is that to me specifically, Ange, or any of you? I'll let all of you think. Rebecca, if you can think of someone right off, please answer.
I don't think I can think of someone right off. Come back to me, I'll have a little think.
Yeah, I'm happy to go, Ange. I think there's a particular rock star trustee I've worked with, and she sort of was someone who led with curiosity, so would just be fascinated about the organization, what we're doing today. But I joined when she had set the bar of that was how a trustee would conduct themselves in meetings, outside of meetings, arriving at strategy away days. So I think having a real passion for not just understanding what the challenges are of the organization today, because if you have a risk register or you are fortunate enough to be working in that industry, then you'll kind of pick up on some of those challenges. But that curiosity can actually help you anticipate, as a really good set of trustees would help to do, is identify what's coming next and what some of the future challenges might be. So I think that curiosity, but also being conscious of where you might not be the expert on a topic, and just reaching out to other people, either from your network, bouncing ideas around with the rest of the trustees. I've also found just going online and finding communities of people who are like-minded and interested and have similar topics that they talk about as a really good place to test ideas. And I've always found it welcoming, particularly when you talk about being a trustee and charities in general. So yeah, that was a particular person who I felt really exemplified what being a great trustee would be.
Excellent, thank you. So curiosity being a valuable trait from your perspective. Thanks for that, Mark. Fiona?
There are a few actually. As a trustee that I've served with, they they were always really, they've retired from the board now, but they were always really good about asking the difficult questions in quite a direct way, I would say, but in a way that made it very clear that they weren't trying to be difficult. They just were holding all of us, the board, and and the work of the charity to account. And I really appreciated the way that they did that, partly because it just sort of made it easier to ride their coattails, but also because I genuinely learned how to get, coming back to Mark's point about tone, how to try and pitch the tone just right, so it wasn't coming over as a criticism, but it was coming over as a, this is something we need to do. And the other is not somebody that I've actually worked with, but when I do interviews as part of my sort of getting on board work, and so I interview quite a lot of trustees, and somebody that I interviewed talked about their chair, and they just described this absolutely wonderful woman who just reached out after every meeting to all the trustees, just a quick sort of touch base after the meetings to find out how exactly, as was I think it was Owen in the comments was saying, but made that a phone call and did it in a way that probably, because they were just having a quick one-to-one call, that people might have felt really comfortable with sharing. Because from a personal point of view, some of the work that I've done with trustees in working groups as opposed to actually in the board, you just get a completely different read on somebody, and people relax into a way of being in a really different way. So I thought that was really interesting. And the person who had interviewed this particular trustee, who is, I think, is a young trustee in the sense that she's sort of between 18 and 30, just said that if she knew that there was something on an agenda that was coming up that she was going to disagree with, she would just go in armed with all the evidence, so that she would really have something to back up her point with. And I thought that was a really good way of positioning what you wanted to say. And it goes back to a point that I wanted to make earlier about, I think, the biggest way that you can make an impact, and sort of answering to Penny's sort of comment in the question for aspiring trustees, is do your research, read your papers, have those questions ready. Anything you don't understand, be absolutely comfortable with saying, I don't understand this. And that is the most important. I think that is the single most important thing you can do to have an impact, is to do that.
Yeah, it's that being prepared that I mentioned earlier. Reading the paper should be the absolute bare minimum, but we know unfortunately that isn't always the case. Rebecca, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, thanks for coming back to me, Ange. I also had to run off for my son for a minute, so apologies, but I'm back. It's interesting because I meet hundreds of astounding trustees like every year, and a lot of them are first-time trustees who I think anyway, just for being brave enough to kind of go, oh, actually I can do this is amazing. I did speak to somebody that I placed about a week ago, and he actually blew my mind a little bit. So I'm going to talk about him because he knew he wanted to be a trustee, had done some little bits of shadowing and things to kind of prepare himself, but he got his first sort of co-optee trusteeship, and he told me about they were in a meeting and they were discussing risk, of course, and he happened to have some sort of inside knowledge about a situation, and it kind of just blew this thing wide out of the water. And I just was like, that's amazing that you felt comfortable enough so early on to say, hey, look, I know this is going to be helpful for us. and we can put them things in place that's going to help us as an organisation. And then the whole organisation, you know, we're impacted by him. I just thought that was an amazing story. So he can be my person.
I think it's absolutely fantastic when people feel comfortable to speak up. You know, what is it within themselves, but also that board environment. And everything we've been discussing today is about balance in some way. You know, what's the context, what's the environment, what's the situation, whichever of these questions we've been answering. And being a trustee means walking this line, doesn't it? You know, there are no clear-cut answers. We've got to be okay with ambiguity and new situations, and we're all working together to find solutions whilst also seeking to make a positive difference, you know, by ourselves and within ourselves and with each other as well. So yeah, thanks so much for that. Mark, I could see you nodding. Is there anything else you wanted to add on that?
I was purely from the point there around the impacts that you have. Reading the papers is so core to that, but I feel that there's a really interesting build there, which is just the papers are kind of one really key part. And I think Rebecca was also talking about sort of your organizational knowledge that you can enrich that with. Those are insights from people who engage with your organization, with your charity, but equally the staff, if you are lucky enough to have any full-time staff, have incredible insight about the organization's challenges, and if they've been in the sector for a long time, will be a huge font of knowledge to help you there. I think the third bit that I just wanted to add in, which I found really, really valuable, is when you start to kind of contrast the brand and the appearance of your charity and how that's perceived externally, because I think a topic we potentially haven't touched on as a trustee is the kind of ongoing continuity and the responsibility you have to that organization long term, and brand and how you're perceived, and understanding where there's connections that you could make with your charity, with other charities who are trying to embark and solve the same system-wide problems are really important. But equally, if there's something that might be undermining or impacting negatively your charity's ability to get its message out and your organization's reach, then as a trustee, being aware of that and constantly looking at the news and thinking about if there are any reports that you're mentioned in, I think is a really useful bit of context for you to bring into those trustee meeting sessions, just to make sure that you've got that external view of how your organization's situated, as well as those kind of internal bits that would come from the report, the constitution, and some of the insights from your efforts you're working with.
Absolutely, Mark, that wider context. And in the meantime, we've had two really interesting questions, quite different questions within the chat. So we'll go on to those. The first one is by Kirsty. How can we know how we're doing as trustees? Is there a set of probing questions where you can ask yourselves at different points that we can benchmark against? Thanks for a great session, panel, says Kirsty. Fiona, I'll go to you first.
Thanks. I'm just going to read that one again, so I get my head around it. Oh, that is a really, really good question, Kirsty. Sort of checking in with yourself and reflecting. Is there a set of probing questions we can ask ourselves at different points? Yeah, I think picking up on something that both Rebecca and Mark were talking about with that Rebecca's anecdote about the trustee who had that piece of information. The thing that you became a trustee for, like obviously there's your passion, but the skills, knowledge or experience that you were recruited onto the board for, are you using that? Is there anything else that you could bring to it? If you're not using your skills that you were recruited for, talk to your chair. You know, is there a different working group that you can be on where they're brought out? I think that's it's not a set of probing questions, but I think that's definitely one question that I would ask myself, and just sort of looking back, sort of helicoptering out, maybe looking at your impact of your charity, like if there's an impact report, where did you fit in with that? What was your role within that? Is probably a good question to look at as well, just so you're being able to reflect upon your role as a trustee without sort of constantly looking at it from being right in the weeds of what you do from meeting to meeting. Those would be two from me anyway.
Excellent, thank you. Mark, how about you?
I think two examples from me would be, as a board, we for the higher education institution that I work with, we regularly run a skills audit, and we take inspiration from the kind of key elements of what it kind of takes to be a good trustee. So the Charities Commission have lots of really useful materials on it, and some of those range from understanding of governance to risk management to a number of other areas that start to talk more about the behaviours and leadership that you might bring. So we used a fairly rudimentary scale of like 1 to 5 about how comfortable we all felt across those areas, and we then kind of brought those together and had a bit of a conversation about, does that feel like we've got the right coverage across those Charity Commission defined areas of what a trustee should do? And as a group, we then thought about, are there additional things we can do, like watching videos and reading reports from maybe serious incident reports that have been shared by the Charities Commission, which are really useful lessons learned materials for if you want to kind of identify gaps in other organisations. And I think they're released on a quarterly or a kind of 6 monthly basis. So that's one example. And also we sort of launched a board development plan. So those were kind of systematic areas of individual areas that we'd identified based on our own experience, where the organisation could, in line with its objectives, continue to grow in. So the questions we asked were, how are we performing against those board development targets, and kind of established key measures of how we were progressing along on those.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mark. I'm just going to hand over Penny for one moment. Penny's going to handle the next question, and then she'll hand right back over to me.
Thank you. The power of Zoom. So I'm just going to take Kavia's question, which is really, really interesting. And I think it's something that all of us who are trustees of organisations that are large enough to have staff really struggle with. So she or he says, as a charity trustee, you often have to walk a fine line to set the organisation strategy and hold overall responsibility, but without doing the doing, which is an SMT role, a staff role. I'm interested in how the panel have navigated that when considering the impact you want to have. Rebecca, what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging, isn't it? Because you don't have necessarily a set of KPIs like you would have if you were in the full-time staff. I think my answer is probably going to be fairly similar to the answer to the previous question, and hitting on some of the stuff that other people have done. But when you start a new trusteeship or get appointed, or when you start any new role, actually think about what you want to achieve. Think about the objectives that you want to have personally, and then you can kind of look back at that and just kind of assess yourself if that's what you're looking for. But there are, skills audits, and there is the Charity Commission, and they do the trustee checking points. I think there was like videos, I haven't seen it for a while, but then there's board reviews and asking the chair to kind of help set those things as well. Probably a good starting point anyway.
Thank you. And what do you think, Mark? How do you work out when you should get in there and get operational, and when you need to draw back and leave the stuff to it?
Yeah, I think I often try and lead a lot of those conversations from the risk register. So as a trustee, I always ask myself, what are the fundamental biggest risks that could sort of, if unmitigated, result in the end of this organization? And I know that's a really kind of negative place to start, but that's the kind of strategic level that as a trustee you need to really orientate yourselves around. And for the case of the social justice knife crime charity that I'm working with, really understanding about the importance of safeguarding, and are users and the people who engage with our services is absolutely critical to making sure that we're delivering on our promises and doing the right thing. So as a trustee, therefore, I then gear all of my focus around making sure we have and asking the questions in board meetings around, do we have the appropriate controls in place to be able to ensure that those processes are being followed in the way that we'd like, or do we need to review any of the procedures that will drive a certain consistency in how those are applied, or the policies that set out how people would act in each of these situations. So always trying to take a step back to what is it we've said in our charitable objects and constitution, and then really understanding what those kind of key risks are, and then figuring out how can we then work with the SMT to make sure that those are operating and being conducted in the way that we absolutely know would happen, but thinking about sometimes you can have a peak of peak scenario where lots of things aren't necessarily happening as you would like them to, so trying to mitigate against those if possible.
Great, thank you. Fiona, anything you'd add to that?
No, I think that's really comprehensive answer, and I love the idea of starting the risk register. I think this question is the question, though it is the question, and I think it is really hard, and it differs from charity to charity, and it also differs from what you're working on. Sometimes you do get a bit closer. I mean, you should never stray into the operations side, I would say, but sometimes you are closer to what's going on depending on what, you know, if you're working on a particular project. But I think in those instances, it's really being aware of that and knowing when to start pulling back out again and just, you know, say, great, we've started that. You might have worked on a strategy, for example, or a particular policy, and knowing that once it's there, it's not your role to see how that is delivered, that you've got to go back up to that strategic level. And I think sort of combining this question with the earlier question about check-ins with yourself, it's part of that. It's checking in and just seeing where you're at, what you're doing, and just constantly sort of reflecting on that. And you're not in isolation as well. You're part of a board. Just how is the board working together? What do other people think? You can just ask their opinion and to say, so, you know, the staff members reached out to me on this because I was working on them. Do you think I should, you know, push it back a bit, or, you know, should I take it on? Because that's why you have a board. It's not just a singular individual. It's about,
I guess that's keeping lines of communication open with the staff as well. Absolutely right. I'm going to hand back to Ange now.
Fantastic, thank you, Penny. We've had a question within the chat from AG saying thanks for these super useful insights. I'm a new trustee at a charity where this is the only that I've been talking about, and in fact the double only. I'm the only person of colour on the board, and I am significantly younger in age than everyone else on the board with much less charity experience. Do you have any tips or advice on how to make an impact with those factors in mind? Well, AG, I've certainly been there. I've been on boards for 20 years, but I still remember it. And there are still times now, even near the age of 50, that I'm still significantly the youngest person and the only person of colour on the board. So I've got things to share, but I'm sure our panel do too. So Rebecca, from a recruiter's point of view, or from personal perspectives, what would you like to advise this member of the audience?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, well done. Well, you've taken up such a big task, and it must have been quite daunting and intimidating. So well done for doing it and for keeping going. And I think that's probably the first massive impact that you've made, even without really trying anyway. You've changed the status quo a little bit. So kind of lean into that. I think you've been appointed for a reason. You've got a diversity of thought there in many different ways. Lean into that too. You will see so many changes just because you're there and just because you are talking and saying things. So yeah, keep going. My advice.
Excellent, thank you. Mark, would you like to add anything?
I'd echo a lot of what Rebecca just said. I think very specifically, find others who may have a shared experience, to kind of listen to how they've approached being a young trustee. So I found myself in a similar experience, in a similar position. So I went on LinkedIn. I actually think that the group is called the kind of Young Trustees Network, or something to that extent. I'll try and find it. And it was a really great place to kind of hear how other people navigated similar hurdles. I think the point around recognizing your lived experience and how that will then help provoke a different conversation from Rebecca, I think is a really important one. And I think another way that you can bring, in addition to the skills that you have, might be some of the kind of perspective of, if you have a particularly different demographic or a different user community, about what some of those kind of shared needs might be. So actually just embracing some of the perspectives that you would bring, and bringing that to the board's agenda, I think is a really important one.
Thank you, Mark. Fiona, how about you?
Yeah, I agree with both what Mark and Rebecca said, and also to say congratulations on your board role. I think it can be really difficult, and as Andrew was saying previously about being an only because you're a person of colour, and then as only because you're the youngest on the board, sometimes that can feel really silencing. Even if you have an amazing board, an amazing chair. So I think, again, it goes to keeping the lines of communication open, and I would hope that people on your board reach out to you and make sure that you're able to speak to all the experience that you are bringing. And a couple of practical things, I suppose, would be, as well as the movement that Mark was talking about, the Young Trustees movement, there's also Action for Trustee Racial Diversity, which is a great organisation to join. And there's a network there that you can, like networking boards, you can post and ask for other people's experiences, and, you know, sort of connect with people there, which is, I think that is really important, just making sure that outside of your own board, that you have people who do share your experiences, because there are other trustees out there. And then a final point, perhaps at the moment when it's appropriate, when your board is recruiting new trustees, perhaps there's a role there to be part of that recruitment subcommittee or working group, and share some of the experiences you've had to that point, you know, to make sure that your board diversity continues to grow.
Thank you so much, Fiona. We're almost at the end of today's session. I have promised to give Penny a couple of minutes at the end. So I am going to start wrapping up just with a summary of some of the points we've discussed today, because we've talked about impact in its broadest sense. So what's the organisational impact in the press, you know, thanks to Mark, in papers and so on? What's our individual impact and brand? What impact do we make on others and in society, and where we can look for the kind of support and finding the balance on our own charity boards, because every charity is so unique. We are all unique, and I think that's how I'd like to leave it. You make an impact because you are there to make a difference. And I deliberately call it lived experience expertise, not lived experience, because that carries a value. It carries some different worldviews and different lenses. No matter who we are, we all have something to add to boards. So I wish you all the best of luck on your trustee journey, whether you're starting out, whether you haven't even joined a board yet, or whether you've been on boards for many, many years. It's great to have all of you here today. Penny, over to you, and thank you everyone so much for your contributions. Thank you so much to our panel.
Thank you so much, Ange, Fiona, Mark and Rebecca, for an absolutely cracking conversation, and thank you to attendees for a really active and useful practical chat as well. I've posted the evaluation form in the chat. Please do tell us what you thought of this session. That will also pop up as you log off Zoom. There's a box on that form for ideas for other sessions for trustees, aspiring trustees, people who work with trustees. So if you have other ideas of things you'd find helpful, please do let us know. That's how we source most of these sessions. Do check out the rest of our trustee Trustee Learning Programme. I've put the link in the chat. It's all completely free. Thank you to our lovely sponsors. All sessions for and about trustees. And thank you so much again to our sponsors, Charisma, Starfish, TPP, Peridot and Diversifying Group. It's thanks to them the session is free, and they're all trustee recruiters if that's something that you're currently looking for. So thank you all for joining us. I hope you all have a lovely afternoon.